You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Liza Rodman and Jennifer Jordan, authors of The Babysitter, My Summers with a Serial Killer. Liza and Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having us. We're really excited about this conversation.
Great to be here.
It's too bad that we don't have a video component, because not only have these two women gotten completely decked out, they're holding tall drinks of some sort or another. We have not asked them to identify what they're drinking, and maybe we'll just leave that out of the conversation.
It would be tequila if I had my druthers.
Mine drinks.
Yeah, mine does not. Mine does not.
Here I am with just plain old bottle of water.
Me too. Oh, we're boring.
So why don't you both go ahead and start by telling us a little bit about your educational background, which I know you have a little bit of overlap with Mr. Thomas here, and then tell a little bit about your professional background too. But Liza, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Okay, good. I went to the University of Massachusetts right out of high school, where I met my friend Jennifer. And I did not finish then. I finished much later, worked as a tax accountant for all these years with this book in my back pocket. Always wanting to write. I participated for many years in a writer's group and always writing, but never publishing. And Jen and I would talk about it on as we went. Finally, we ended up finding a moment in time where we were both able to come together and write this book.
Very cool. Jennifer, how about you?
I'm trying to edit it down because my story takes a while.
Oh, go right ahead.
After UMass, I ended up taking the first job offered to me, which was typing in a radio station in Boston. And within 6 months, I had my own talk show because my boss at the time was wonderful and said, I know you're not here to type, but what can I do to keep you? And I said, 22 years old. I'd like my own talk show because I think I could do it. That led to writing, taking the radio into writing, and then the writing into books. Found myself just in love from journalism into a nonfiction writing. Sitting on the couch one day when I was returning back to Boston to visit my dear friend Liza, she says to me, I'm not sure I ever told you, but I was babysat by a serial killer. And so full stop, I say to her in these words, that's your book. I know you've been wanting to write a book. That's your book. And it's going to be called The Babysitter.
To which I said no. To which I said no.
For the next 2 or 3 years, whenever I'd come back to Boston to visit, stay with Liza, sit on the couch, drink our wine, toes curled underneath us. And I'd say, okay, so how's The Babysitter coming? And she'd say, I don't want to talk about it. It's in a drawer somewhere. It's up to 1,000 damn pages.
Oh, no.
I don't know. And so
There were several poor drafts.
I found myself between projects, and I called her up and I said, how about this? Why don't I help you do this? Because I know that this is a tricky narrative. I know how to do it. So let me help you. And she burst into tears, and here we are.
Now, Jen, at this point, had you already written your first in a series of books?
Yes, I'd written 4 books.
So you actually were able to turn to Liza and say, look, I can actually help you with this because I've actually birthed some books.
Exactly. And the reason that I was so confident about it was I had 2 books under my name and 2 books that I ghosted. So I knew exactly how to get into another character's voice. And I also knew how to split those voices because my third book was written with one of the Boston Marathon bombing victims. I knew that I shouldn't just tell it through her story. I should tell it through the 3 first responders who saved her life on Boylston Street that day. So I was able to flip from voice to voice in writing that book, and I knew I could do it. And so when Liza presented this story to me, I'm like, we have to obviously tell it through the young Liza's voice. We also have this serial killer's horrific, just ghostly, ghastly crimes on the other side that you can't tell through a 10-year-old's voice. So it was that delicate balance of the omniscient narrator and the memoir. And
I remember exactly where I was sitting when she said, "Oh, that's no problem. We're going to do Liza, Tony, Liza, Tony, Liza, Tony." The whole world opened up because the structure of it had dogged me for so long. And I call her my literary fairy godmother because that's what she was. And that's what she continues to be, by just opening her world to me and saying, we can do it this way and let's do it. And that's what we did.
Liza, how much of your original 1,000 pages of draft ultimately ended up in the final book? Did you have to scrap all of it and start over with Jen? Or like, how did you ultimately make all this work?
Sometimes we worked independently. Sometimes we worked, as we've described it before, shoulder to shoulder, word to word. And then other times I worked on my chapters, Jen worked on the serial killer chapters. And then one of us would get stuck and we'd talk to one another. It was all over the place. Oh, my phone, I'm sorry, my watch is talking to me. So now I'm going to put it down and throw it out the window. So I'll be right back. Hang on. We'll have to cut this out.
No, we're going to leave it in.
We ran the gamut. We really did. And so how much of the original draft? All of the original draft in terms of the stories. Same stories I've been writing for years. We just made them better. But the stories didn't really change. And then the Tony part, Jen really took the research. She took the research from me and she wrote it. We just went back and forth because I'd been researching for 15 years before we came together, because I'd had a series of dreams about Tony that made me ask the questions to my mother. What's going on? Why am I dreaming about this man after all this time? And that's her famous line from my book of, I know he became a serial killer. I know he became a pediatrician. In thinking back about it, my mother's since passed away, but in thinking back about it, I really think, even though it sounds so outrageous, I really think she was like, he became a serial killer. It didn't have anything to do with us.
Wow.
And it wasn't the kind of world where we were all connected like we are now. So that really was somebody else's problem. And my mother had enough problems of her own that I think she was just good at compartmentalizing. And we didn't have a news cycle. I don't know how much she actually knew other than he became a serial killer. And she was quite close to his mother at one time. And then his mother had passed away. And here's the other thing. We were summer people.
Oh, so I was wondering about that.
Everything that went on down there during the winter months, we had no window on. So that also made the book a little bit difficult to write, but we worked through it.
It's probably worth mentioning about Cape Cod. Can you explain a little bit for our listeners who are not from the Cape and don't know about the two worlds, a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. The province town is all the way out on the tip of Cape Cod. So it's the very last town you come to before you jump in the Atlantic Ocean. And it is that sort of, I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but it's very sparsely populated, except during the summer. There can be 2,500 people living there in the winter and year round, and then 30,000 in the summer. And that's how intense it is. And everything closes, at least in 1968, 1969. The hotels close, the restaurants close. There was a lot of stuff in our research about the people talking to one another about whether or not this place was still open. They were always trying to find a place to be. I think there was one local bar or two local bars. That really was it. Everything else shut down. You could hear the wind whistle through it down the street. So it was poor. And it was desolate in the wintertime. And in the summer, it just was vibrant. And I don't know if you guys have been to Provincetown. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. It has a certain quality of light there that draws artists. And it has a vibrant gay community when no place else did in the 1960s. It was Provincetown and San Francisco and New York. It's sheltered. It has a long history in the fishing industry, and it was the first place the Pilgrims came to, but it's very sparse, even now, today, in the wintertime.
And also another thing about the summer versus the local is that the local population, the 12-month population was basically poor and basically working just menial jobs until the summer when they could beef up
when they made their money.
And when they could fish.
And that's still true.
And the summer people were in their Lily Pulitzers and their yachts and their clam bakes. And so there was a really strong divide and animosity between the locals and the summers. And Tony was considered a summer kid for the first several years of his life because he did live in Somerville by Boston, a suburb of Boston, and then would go down to P-Town to stay with his aunt over the summer. So he was a summer kid. So there was the divide started between him and the locals at that point. And then when he went down to finish high school after he was charged and convicted of attempted rape in Somerville, then he had to become a local. And so that whole, whatever was going on in his head, that couldn't have helped, shall I say. Sure. That couldn't have helped his sense of place and his sense of who he was in that place. Because there was always that divide of, are you one of us? Or are you one of the Lily Pulitzer crowd in your J. Crew khakis?
Full disclosure, my partner, Pamela Arnois, is from West Barnstable. And so she grew up there, and her perceptions of Cape Cod are so radically different than mine. But I was a young professional in Boston, and we'd go to the Cape on weekends, and we'd go to the Cape in the summertime. Her perception of Cape Cod, and she would have grown up there in the 70s, it was a place that she couldn't wait to escape from. Although she recognizes the natural beauty of the place and has a great fondness for it and the people that live there, she's never lived there since she left at age 18 to go away to college. She doesn't have a tremendous interest in going back, and she talks a lot, when I ask, about the darkness of the off-season and alcohol and drug abuse. And she wasn't necessarily drawn into that, but she saw it. And she said she talked a lot about one of the things her father first said to her when she first graduated from college and came back and lived at home for a couple of months. She was applying for jobs in Boston, and then she began commuting up there before she had enough money to get her own apartment. And one of the things her father said, and he was in construction on the Cape, was, "You really want off Cape Cod, don't you?" That was like a desperate need on her part to get out. And yet I think of Cape Cod as this beautiful, fun, bucolic summer place. And she's sure not like that in February.
No, it's not like that in February. And for a while, I lived on the Cape for 15 years before I moved up to Boston and raised my son, my youngest son. In fact, raised all my kids there. I always described it as you drive over the bridge in winter and it feels like someone threw a wet blanket over your head and they're not going to take it off until May. Now, Jen has a totally different experience because she came in the summer and it was candy canes and New York Times crossword puzzles and her fabulous grandparents and her grandfather who looked like Anwar Sadat. And she just has this amazing experience of Cape Cod.
And my grandmother worked at Lily Pulitzer. So.
Yeah. Oh, for real?
And it was Osterville, Jen.
Yeah.
Osterville.
Where the money was. So. But there is a darkness to it that remains to this day.
And that darkness is part of, we get asked, and maybe I'm fast forwarding too much for your outline here, but Tony Costa, one of the reasons he got away with his murders as long as he did was because he was caught up in that darkness with everybody else and the alcohol and the drug, and everybody was drunk and everybody was high and everybody was screwed up. He just fit into a darkness that there had been any sunshine. People would say, well, what's going on over here? This is not, all of Tony's girlfriends are disappearing. But because it was part of this miasma of the 12-month capers, and especially the 12-month P-towners, that much more removed from West Barnstable and Osterville and Hyannis, another hour away, enabled him to continue his...
Free reign.
Yeah, free reign.
I don't know if you've heard about the Lady of the Dunes.
Yes.
Yeah, we've covered
her identity.
Yeah, we've covered that. Yeah.
Oh, have you?
Yes.
Isn't that an amazing story?
It is.
Finally, there was a documentary that got done
Right.
this year. And I think it's because of that documentary that all of a sudden it brought light to the case that was on the back burner. And suddenly these documentary showings were selling out. And I think that was part of what pushed them to get back in the game with this DNA, because there was a lot of talk about not getting back in the game. So I'm so glad she's identified. But as part of the conversation about darkness on the Cape, that stayed with Provincetown until right now, as we're talking about it. And I think much more so than the Tony Costa murders. And then there were the Krista Worthington murders. There's something about the desolation down there that allows people to get away with things they might not be able to get away with elsewhere.
As beautiful as it is, I often have felt like Provincetown feels like the end of the world.
And it is.
And it is. When you look at the arm that is Cape Cod, it's pretty much as far as you can go. There's such a contrast between the dark part of the year and that 90-day or so summertime, fun time. Once you hit Labor Day, it's over.
Yeah, and that darkness doesn't go away in the summertime, though. It lays really low. There's an undercurrent of it everywhere. It's particularly in the bars, because it's Provincetown, one big bar. And one big party scene, at least it was for my mother. And it is now for a lot of people. I think that as the two things rub up against one another, it was a hangout for the Bulger gang, for Whitey Bulger's gang.
Okay.
Hung out at the Crown and Anchor. And the more you read, the more you find out. It was a good place to get away, where nobody held you accountable.
A good place to hide.
So for our listeners who may not be aware of the particulars of the Tony Costa case, and we did cover this in our episode with Casey Sherman, but I definitely want to get it from your perspective. How did you eventually learn, oh my God, this guy who was looking after me was a serial killer? How did you come to that realization, and what did that do to you to learn it?
I carried memories with me into my adulthood. I had no idea that they were memories that wrapped around Tony and Tony's. So I always knew that there were murders that happened, but I wasn't clear on the who, what, when, where, why. So I didn't find out until I went back to college in 2003 to finish my bachelor's degree that I'd abandoned all those years ago in field dormitory. And I started having these dreams. And I went to a hippy dippy Vermont college, what do we want to call it? Distance learning program. They encourage you to journal. My favorite thing, right? I'm definitely going to do this. There I am journaling. These dreams started to get more and more violent. And I was always being chased. And there was always this man with no face. And I was always in fear of my life. Always. So I started journaling them. I started writing them down, trying to figure out what the common elements were. And then one night I had this absolute nightmare of Tony Costa following me down the hotel. I'm getting ahead of myself, but both my mother and her best friend owned motels across the street from one another in Provincetown. And so the dream was that I was in the hallway of the motel. I was about 10 years old, and he came up to me and he put a gun to my head and he told me to count to 4 in Italian. And I said I didn't know Italian. And then when I opened my eyes, he was gone. So I went to my mother at that point, because these dreams had the same theme and had really started to haunt me. Started to worry about myself. So I went to my mother and I said, why am I did something happen to me that you're not telling me? Because there was a lot she never told me. That's when I said, I don't understand why I'm dreaming about Tony Costa. And she said, I know he became a serial killer.
Oh my God.
So that was really how I learned that he was a serial killer. I often describe it as a moment of when, I don't know who amongst us has ever had, I once had somebody give me this horrible hash oil and my whole world slowed down. That's what it was like. Everything slowed way down. And I was like, it was just a bizarre moment. It was like a reckoning. And I knew that all of my fears and so many of the things I was dealing with emotionally may have to do with this time period. And so I went back and started researching, and there was really not much of a Google at that point. There was some of a Google, but not much. So I went to Kent State and I started researching a book, the papers of a guy who had written a book. Leo D'Amour wrote In His Garden. I don't know if you're familiar with that book. It was the big book on the case. Leo had passed away and sent his papers to Kent State. So I went to the special collections and started paging through and found it was a treasure trove. It was Tony's glasses and his bracelets and the trial transcript from Massachusetts and hundreds of hours of audio tape of those interviews in jail and just 10,000 pieces of paper that I went through over the 15 years.
And so you actually were able to listen to Tony Costa. That must have been, is nerve-wracking even close to what that was for both of you to listen to that?
It was at one point so familiar and so foreign all at the same time, because you hear it. We wrote a lot. Jen and I wrote a lot about his accent, how he would flip. And you really hear it in those audio tapes, don't you, Jen?
You do.
It's 1 minute he's British, and the next minute he's hardcore Boston, Somerville. He just flips around. So it was pretty much, it's hard to listen to.
And I have a great transcriber out here in Utah who's a student of mine in film school at one point in her career. And so we sent all the tapes to her to transcribe for us so that we could get the direct quotes. And poor thing, this sweet little Mormon girl.
Yeah.
And she called me at one point and said, Jen, I'm not sure I can finish this.
Oh,
This is
Wow.
so dark. And I got to tell you, she's heard more of it than I have, because even though I'm a hardened journalist, I was like, whoa.
You got shingles while we were writing.
I got shingles from my level of stress. And this poor young 20-something going through and having to transcribe. So she had to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth.
Oh, wow.
And she finally said, I finished it, but it finished me. I felt so bad for her because, there's just nothing like getting that deep as a transcriber has to into the words to get them verbatim. Because we said we're going to do verbatim quotes. And so, she's listened to more of it than either Liza or I have because she had to. And the poor thing, she's probably forever scarred.
It does. It sticks with you. And I imagine, too, you've taken the time to look through the crime scene photos, and all of those things are awful.
I wouldn't do the crime scene photos. I know Casey talks a lot about those crime scene photos. And I remember Jen saying to me, do not do it because you can't undo it.
Exactly.
And so I did.
Exactly.
And we don't need them to write it. I went to a doctor friend of ours here in Salt Lake to go through the autopsy reports with me so that I could understand the medical jargon.
Oh, wow.
Even he, another sweet Mormon, looks up at one point and goes, oh my God, this is a very angry man who did this. And then he tried having to describe to me exactly what the autopsy reports are indicating. I've been a doctor for 50 years and I've never, ever. Why? How could you? Why would you ever read an autopsy report of a deranged serial killer?
And yet, even after we didn't see him, those victims stay with us. They stay with us.
Yeah, because in order to write the scenes that we did, particularly the murder scenes, we had to envision exactly what happened, what was done to those bodies.
We also had Tony's, what do you want to call it, Jen? His
Prison
account,
diary,
his manuscript. No, he's not his prison diary, but his manuscript. He had a manuscript that never got published. So we had that. And there were some pretty vivid descriptions in that.
He basically
had another unpublished manuscript from the newspaper.
And so these were books by Costa and by this journalist that described Costa's crimes, but were never published. So how do you gain access to something like that?
They're in the archives. They're there for the taking. They were all there. It was such a shock when I came upon them. Remember, Jen? I was like, you can't believe what I'm holding in my hand. Because Tony's lawyer, when Tony was arraigned, the day he was arraigned, the lawyer, or just days afterwards, took Tony and his wife into the conference room at Bridgewater State Prison and had them sign away their life rights. So that ink wasn't even dry on the arraignment before he was exploiting these people. They were indigent. Wow. They had no money for a defense. The lawyer knew it. The lawyer was a friend of Tony's uncle and a landowner. So he knew right from the beginning he was going to exploit those stories. Now, I'm not making a judgment. I'm just saying that's how it worked. It wouldn't work that way today. It would never fly.
With that, Leo D'Amour, that was before Leo D'Amour.
Oh, no, it was what's his name? No, the guy who sat at the table and with the journalist who wrote the book and never published it. He was an old newspaper man. Lester Allen was his name. So Goldman tried to sell the book. He tried to sell it first to Kurt Vonnegut. And Kurt Vonnegut said, I don't want anything to do with this. Even I can't clean up Tony Costa. That's a direct quote. So Vonnegut turned it down, and it was over money because the lawyers wanted to get paid and Vonnegut wanted more than the lawyers could give him. He was approached first and walked away. And that's how I know Vonnegut didn't want anything to do with it. After a while, he tried to peddle it to some other writers, and they all turned him down except for this one newspaper man in Hyannis named Lester Allen, who sat at the defense table and listened to every word and then wrote this unpublished manuscript that exists in the archives and special collections at Kent State.
And had spent untold hours interviewing Tony.
And Davis.
Way before a defense table, when Tony was being held in the Barnstable jail, and then...
He's the interviewer on all those audio tapes.
And it's remarkable to listen to those tapes read through the transcripts because, again, and just how much, what's the word, Liza? Any attorney or any journalist conducted that kind of interview today with the Me Too movement, because Tony's wife was involved in all of this, and the way
It was harassment.
And they totally abused her on these tapes. Tell me about your sex with Tony. Tell me about.
And then tell me again.
Tell me again. And did he do this to you? And did he like to do this to you? And this poor girl, she was 19 with 3 babies at that point. So all by way of saying, what happened 50 years ago with Tony, with his wife, with his attorneys, it would never happen today. Not that he wasn't guilty. I'm not defending Tony Costa, but the way he was treated, the way his wife was treated, the way the defense took total advantage of their destitution. It's just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And it's part of the reason that he was able to continue his killing, because there was so much ineptness. Keystone cops here and there, and everybody looking out for themselves and nobody looking out for...
Of course, we're looking back on it. And I'm sure that in real time, it was the best they could do. It was the best they could do, but it wasn't good enough, and it cost a lot of women their lives.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. And so the reason that all this material ended up at Kent State is because of Leo D'Amour's work. Leo D'Amour was best buddies with Bernie Flynn, who was the state police investigator on this case. He was the one who cracked the case. They were best buds. And so in that archive at Kent State, he gave Leo everything. George Killen, too, also from the state police, released evidence into Leo's hands from the trial. Boxes and boxes of evidence. Now, that would never happen today either. And Leo's son tells me that there's even more boxes of evidence from the Costa trial in his mother's garage that she won't let him touch. Wow.
So somewhere there's the gun. We don't know what happened to the gun because we never came across that. Yeah, it was the Wild West of everything.
But you never knew him as a sadistic, horrible serial killer. For you, he was just your babysitter. What are some of the positive memories that you have, Tony?
That's the tough part of this conversation for me, because I had to reconcile, and it was tough in the writing process too, of that person, that cool cousin, which is the way I looked at him, and who taught me how to blow smoke rings, and the man I was researching. I still can't, and I probably never will be able to meld the two to make a human being. So to me, they're two different people, because for us, there are actually 4 of us that this happened to, but I did not put everybody else in the book for privacy reasons.
Sure.
And so I just made it about my experience. And I was the oldest and I had the most memories. So it made sense for me to do it. But to answer your question, everyone just thought he was a great guy. That was the refrain that we heard over and over again.
Yep.
No one suspected him. No one imagined this could be true. Although I think Avis, when he was arrested, I think she must have known. Yeah, his wife. We just remembered him as, it was just one big good time. He was driving from dump to dump. He was the handyman at the Royal Coachman Motel. He was driving from dump to dump, and somehow he got roped into taking the four of us with him. And so we were in this really cool old truck. So many memories, even the smell of the floor in that truck and the sand. I can still see it all. That's how real it is. And I have a kind of a creepy memory. I remember things I wish I could forget. Some of those are some of my fondest memories, being in the sand and the sun and the music, which was huge, both in the book, in my life, and hopefully in the docuseries. The music was, you remember that static on the AM radio? Because you couldn't get another station except WRKO out of Boston.
Yes.
And we're always fiddling with just so many things, tactile things about being in that truck, being with him. And he was nice to us. And that was unusual because not too many people were. Everybody was always trying to get rid of us. And we really didn't feel that way with him. Or at least I should say, I didn't feel that way with him. So it was a totally positive, for the most part, experience. There are some shadows that Jen feels very specifically that I've blocked some stuff out. And we've had this conversation a billion times. I'm not sure I would remember him so fondly. But don't forget, I was dealing with this crazy mother. So there was a much bigger monster than Tony Costa. She was feeding me hot dogs every night. That's really where my fear was with her.
So when you guys were talking about the division of work in the book, Jen, it sounds like you spent a lot of your time writing the Tony Costa-centric chapters. Writing about a serial killer is not easy, but was it easier for you to handle it than asking Liza to handle it?
It was never, I don't think it was ever a question that in the division of labor, I would tackle the omniscient narrator of Tony, because as Liza said, done 15 years worth of amazing research and just handed me these boxes, which for me was like manna from heaven. And yeah, we never had a debate about that. Liza had enough to do with really figuring out her narrative and how much of her very troubled, very painful, very revelatory childhood she was going to put on the page. And in fact, one of our toughest moments as co-writers was when she said to me, "I don't want to use the word abusive," referring to my mother. And I said, "Sweetheart, this is a mother that made you eat the cold hot dog for breakfast if you couldn't choke it down at dinner. This is a mother who threw you across the room for sitting on a cushion. This is the mother who we have to at least have the reader acknowledge." And so for me, it was just a gently, lovingly bring my dear friend along the process of memoir. As I said to her early in the process, this is the bravest thing you're ever going to do in your life, because you have got to unzip your soul and reveal it to the world. And it is going to be excruciating. And she came along with more grit and more bravery and more like, all right, than any of my ghost projects, any have been able to do. To answer your question, Kristin, I was busy with the Tony chapters and putting on my journalistic hat. So beyond the shingles, I didn't invade my life anymore. But it was also in helping Liza realize that her bravery was going to be rewarded. That in really telling the truth of this very abusive mother, that she would show the amazing contradiction that she was more afraid of her mother than she was of a serial killer. And that would make the book the powerful tool it is today.
Part of me thinks that a lot of the key people in your life, Liza, let you down on very profound levels. In other words, we may all love our flawed, imperfect human beings that came in.
We still do.
But at the same time, we're talking about really profoundly letting you down. This isn't just, I'm disappointed because, I don't know, my parents didn't let me go to the college I wanted to go to, or wouldn't let me go to the high school dance or that camping trip I wanted to go on. This is much more fundamental than that. And then we have Tony Costa, who was, by all accounts, an incredibly charming, charismatic,
sick
guy, but he managed to attract a crowd. And yet, he's doing horrific stuff while you guys are following behind him like the Pied Piper.
It's interesting that you recount that, because the Pied Piper thing is something Jen and I struggled with in the book, because I had one interview which I was unable to use because she threatened to sue me after she sat with me for 4 hours. And so I just said, forget it. There was one story that she told about the sire. You remember in the book they called him sire?
Yes.
She told me that was a joke, that they were all sitting around and he was shooting peas out of his nose or some crazy shit. And they were all doing drugs, and it was White Rabbit time, Grace Slick and Jefferson Airplane. He was pontificating about something in his kitchen. And there were all these much younger people sitting around because, of course, Avis was so much younger than him. And so he was this, and you have to remember that. I think that's a central factor here, is that he was so much older than her that if he had a posse, and we believe he did, it was more of an age thing and he can give me drugs thing than it was that he was a spiritual leader, if you will. The sire idea was a joke. And they called him that because he was pontificating. He was high and he was pontificating. And they were like, all right, sire. Yeah, okay, shut up now. And it stuck. And we're talking about it today.
He's presented in Casey's book as almost being like an East Coast Charlie Manson. And I'm interested, if the two of you were at this material for quite a while, do you see him as having that same sort of Charles Manson-like mystique, or maybe not so much?
No.
Yeah, I don't either. I see Charles Manson as much more sophisticated.
Smarter, way smarter.
Smarter, much more in tune with his posse, as Liza was saying, with his acolytes. He had no interest in the acolytes. He had no interest in anyone around him but himself. The teenagers that hung around him
had interest in him.
Garlands on his robes, but he didn't, I doubt he could even name them.
Yeah.
Whereas Charles Manson made a study out of people, and would never give Tony the, if you will,
I know, I was thinking the same thing.
Or the title of a Charles Manson. Tony, it's almost like Tony killed by accident.
Yeah, he couldn't help himself. Yeah, it was just
For Charles Manson, it was a design. He had something in mind with the Sharon Tate killings and the fact that he evaded prosecution for a while, whereas Tony evaded it because of the Keystone Cops in P-Town.
And Tony went into the police station. He went into the police station
Tony
over
went in saying, I'm innocent. I didn't do it. What are you talking about? You have a parking ticket. What?
Manson would have never done that. I see them as very different.
I want to push back lightly in that Tony Costa did get away for a time. He got away with multiple murders.
But not because of his intelligence. He got away with multiple murders because of the absolute...
Because of the times. Because of the times at first.
The word I can't come up with. The incompetence of the P-Town, the Truro, the Provincetown, and the Boston police. 4 police departments, all of whom were not talking to each other. All of whom had cited him, and they didn't tell each other. So Tony was able to drive to Boston in the last victim's car, drive the car to Burlington, Vermont, drive around, get on a bus, go to... It was not Tony's intelligence. It was the cops' incompetence. I don't know the particulars of the Charles Manson and how he was finally caught and blah, blah, but believe me, they are very two separate. And am I wrong in remembering that Charles Manson never actually killed? Wasn't it his...
No, he never did.
No, he directed...
It was always his followers.
Yeah,
He's never smart enough to have anyone put the knife in their hand.
Which is a big difference.
Huge difference. Tony was the killer. Charles Manson was not.
And Tony's victims came to him. Charles Manson went looking for his victim. And then other people execute. Tony's victims came to him. So I think even though the similarities... I can't get the image of that Hollywood film out of my head of him on the farm with all those women who were serving him. And he was like a spiritual leader, Manson. Tony was just sick and full of it. Full of himself.
It's a good tagline to sell a book. The Charles Manson of P-Town Killers.
But he wasn't.
I do want to get you guys to talk to us a little bit about I guess harassment is probably the best term that I can come up with, that both you and Casey Sherman were subjected to during your various book events on the Cape. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there and whether that has continued since?
I can. It has not continued since because I had to shut down access, which as an author, I was really disappointed to have to do. But I had to stop putting my email on my website. People can still find me if they want to, but I've had to shut down a lot of access. And that's too bad because readers had access to me and sent me some wonderful notes. But what happened was the bookstore owner, the day before the event, got an email that was brutal. And so he sent it to me and I said, what do you want to do? And he said, no, I think we should go forward. So because of the brutal nature, then all of a sudden the next morning, and that night, that same night, so it's now the night before the event, and comments are starting to crop up on the Provincetown Community Space page from all of these. Townies is such a derogatory term somehow, because I wanted to be a townie. It was locals who had been there and spent their lives in Provincetown and were friends of Avis's and really felt that this was rubbing Avis's nose in what had happened. And that her children were still there. And I can see their perspective. I just don't share it. I can see it. But the comments were ruthless and they got worse and worse. And there were hundreds of them. And so the next morning, I called the Provincetown police and I got Sergeant Enos on the line. Now, Enos is an old-time Provincetown name. And I said, do you know what's going on at the bookstore tonight? And he said, I know the story, but we backtracked. So I knew he knew exactly what was going on. And I said, look, I'm afraid someone's going to get hurt because there's a lot of vitriol online. And he said, I don't have anybody on tonight. I only got one guy on, which is what they had on the night Tony Costa killed those women, by the way. But I'll send a guy by a couple of times. And I wasn't really happy with the response, but I knew it was the response I was going to get. And then it got so intense that the bookstore owner's friends started calling him and saying, so at 2:00, he canceled. We talked and we agreed to cancel the event. And honestly, I was so upset by that point in time and so stressed out about what was going to happen that night. I was afraid. We live in a world where people walk into movie theaters and blow people away for no reason. These people had a reason. So I was afraid. And some of Avis's sons got in on the conversation online. So I said, great, let's cancel. I'm done. He then, because in an effort to be fair, canceled Casey's event at the same time. Casey had a very different reaction than I had. I went home and pulled the covers over my head and said, get me out of Provincetown. And Casey went after them. So that's what happened. And I still don't support it. I think that we should be able to talk about our work, but they shot Salman Rushdie on the stage in New York. So I just don't want to screw around with it. It's not important enough to me to put myself or my family members who were going to be there and my friends in jeopardy, let alone the people that I didn't know that were going to be there. We just didn't need another one of those.
So would that preclude you having a book signing or an event in New York or Boston or San Francisco or?
No, I think it was very particularly P-Town. And I think it was the proximity to Avis, his former wife, and his children and grandchildren that sparked that locals townie fervor, as I call it, the P-Town Mafia, that we ran into in writing the book. And I think they closed ranks and circled the wagons. And no, we wouldn't have an issue anywhere else but in P-Town. We could do it in West Barnstable. We could do it in Chatham. Just the P-Town locals that still knew, that the ones that knew Tony and the ones that still not defended him, but really circled their wagons around Avis.
They defended him. Some of them defended him.
That was the problem. That was the problem, Bill. It had nothing to do with the book, a book signing per se. It was in P-Town where the murders happened, and that there were still people alive that knew Tony and knew too much. Because
we got a lot of
the circling of the wagons around some of our sources started in the writing, in the research process. We were told by numerous people, I was told not to talk to you.
And not only that, but I was told not to talk to you. And if you talk, I can't tell you what's going to come down on your head. That's what we were told. You will be sorry if you ... Over and over again. Don't contact me again.
And we knew that kind of bullying was a lot of hot air. But as far as gathering people in a room in this day and age, as Liza was saying, with nutcases doing all
Not worth it.
sorts of evil because they can.
Yeah.
It's a sad place in our society that you really have to think twice about exposing yourself and exposing the people you love and the people you respect to crazies.
And this is a Provincetown story. This is a Provincetown story. It's a local story. It's a Barnstable story. It's an Eastham story. One of the victims was from Eastham. So it's a local story. It's not that it's absolutely relevant there. And the people who live, a lot of the people that live there don't even know the story. I had a client on my tax practice who lives in Provincetown. I said, "Oh, do you know the Tony Costa story?" Don't know the Tony Costa story. People have a right to know what happened there, but it wasn't worth it for me to take the risk with the lives of other people. It just wasn't. And I had gotten myself to a place where I felt brave enough to stand up and talk about censorship before the event. But what if? I just couldn't take that chance.
Yeah. As you pointed out, Salman Rushdie was stabbed on a stage in New York for
how many years later, right?
So many years later. Yeah. Like almost 3 decades. Yeah.
And it's really important to remember that as this was going down, I was saying, this isn't going to happen to me. You almost have magical thinking when you're threatened like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
This isn't really this can't really happen, but you know what? It can. It took me, I think, and it took Jeff Peters some time to put that together and say, yeah, we're not going to be jeopardizing. We're not going to be doing this. We're not going to be doing it. And they felt emboldened by the fact that we backed off and that he backed off.
I can imagine.
They were emboldened by that, which is a shame, but I can't control that either.
And yet they were emboldened and yet frustrated because our book sales numbers shot through the roof.
I know.
The minute that they did that, because we hit the New York Post, we hit Fox News, we hit a couple of other national outlets that were like, what? Censorship at P-Town after all these years?
Of all places.
I remember seeing the New York Post article and going, whoa, like that's because we just arranged to interview Casey. I had read your book. I'd read his book. We were arranging to interview Casey. And I saw that and I said, oh my God, this is crazy.
It's an interesting thing about that Post interview, because the same guy interviewed me that interviewed Casey, his name. But when he published that article in the Post, it was full of inaccuracies.
Oh,
and
really?
So I got right on the line and said, before you publish mine, let's clear some things up. And you know what? I never heard from him again.
Oh, wow.
It is the New York Post.
It is the New York Post after all.
What's in the future for the two of you? Are you collaborating again on anything, or are you doing separate projects?
Collaborating on life.
We totally are. It's unusual if we don't talk during the day, because we got so used to it during the writing process. She's, you know what I love about this? Because I'm not a phone person. So I love the fact that you have to pick up the phone now because we're writing a book together.
Yeah, 40 years she'd never take my call, but now she knows she has to. Not right now. I'm just focusing. I'm working on a ghost project with somebody here in Salt Lake. The thing I love about ghostwriting is I don't have to talk about it. Also, Liza and I are in negotiations for the film option, for the docuseries option.
Yeah, this would be amazing.
Talk about that yet because it's still in the process. I've spent too many years talking about my work rather than just working. So I love saying, can't talk about it, but thanks for asking.
Nice.
I'm doing the same. I'm working on another project in Hampton about the story of the contrabands that has been swept under the rug. We have Williamsburg, we have Jamestown, but Hampton, because it's African-American history, been forgotten at the time.
Yes.
And it literally was the beginning of all of it. So I hope to get that story out before too long.
Yes, that's fantastic. And you are right, definitely overdue. We look forward to hearing all about your future projects, the ones you can talk about and the ones you can't. And we just can't thank you enough for spending time with us here on Mind Over Murder today.
I have enjoyed it so much. Thank you guys very much. Thanks for the work you do, and thanks for your help with writers and books.
That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.